So, welcome to the class of Sydney's Apology for Poetry. And before starting Sydney's Apology for Poetry, we need to know the basic, the general features of Renaissance criticism. Now, we all know that how Renaissance happened and what Renaissance actually is. Now, in the year 1453, with the fall of the Constantinople, because of the attacks of the Turks, the Turkey, the Turkey attacked Constantinople in 1453, and what happened? A huge group of Greek scholars, they move to westward. Actually, they flee from Constantinople, the Byzantium civilization. The capital of Byzantium was Constantinople. They moved westward and they reached Italy. And when they reached Italy, they brought with them the treasure trove of wisdom and knowledge. Now, these refugees took shelter in the various capitals of Europe, and basically they flocked around Italy. And there was a new awakening. The people of Italy, and along with Italy, the Europe actually in general, they became aware of a new flow of knowledge, which knowledge was actually a moved, uh, uh, which was different from the extant theocratic knowledge, and it actually focused more on human being in general. So knowledge and literature and culture and social norms, which were erstwhile very much theocratic, that were centered around God and theology, that actually shifted from God to man. It became geocentric from theocentric. Earlier, it was theocentric. It became now geocentric. Now, thus was ushered in the Renaissance or the revival of learning. So there was, we all know the heritage, the glorious civilization of the Greeks and the Roman that belonged to the classical age. And in the meantime, the middle period between the classical age and the Renaissance, that was the Middle Age, when we find that the church was more powerful, and all knowledge, all language, all culture, and everything that we see, that were dipped in theological dictas, and that were basically based on the controls of the church. So that was the very general characteristics of the Middle Ages. Now, what happened from classical age to Middle Age, and then it moved on to Renaissance? We find again that again the common man, the learned man, both the common and the learned man, they became interested in those classical tendencies of learning, those classical books. They became interested in that wisdom that were there in the classical period. Now, that's why Renaissance is also known as the revival of learning. It revived the classical knowledge, the classical wisdom that we find during the Greco-Roman age, the Greco-Roman culture, art, and literature. Though all these things were revived, theology was the main content of the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the main content was theology, and the outlook of life was basically theocratic, and they were actually controlled by church, and Christianity itself controlled the life within and without. Now, when Christianity is in power, when Christianity is controlling the life and culture and knowledge and wisdom of the common people, what Christianity what Christianity will do, it will try to debase, it will try to debunk the pagan religion that were there during the Greco-Roman period. So, to the Middle Ages, during the Middle Ages, to Christianity, the Greco-Roman pagan religion and culture was something which was hidden, which was not up to the mark, which was not at all good or worthy. But what happened during the Renaissance period, there was not only the revival of learning, but there came a new view of seeing religion, of interpreting religion. People started questioning the interpretations of the church, interpretation of Christianity made by the church. So it was not only the revival of learning, but also the reformation of religion. The standards of judgment during the ages, which were theocratic, during the Renaissance, it became much more literary and aesthetic. So during Renaissance, what happened? People became interested again in the basic aesthetics of life. People became interested again. People wanted to revive the basic literary tendencies and aesthetics of life, which were just ignored during the Middle Ages. So if you see the Renaissance paintings, you will see that the paintings, they represent human beings more, as they are more close to life. They are lifelike. But during the Middle Ages, if you see the paintings of the Middle Ages, you will find that those paintings were very artificial, and there the human figures looked almost like puppets. But Renaissance, actually, that is a tendency. It wanted to show human beings as human beings, and it wanted to put human being at the very center of knowledge, at the very center of this world, this society, the family, and everything that we see around. All these things are for man, are for the human beings, not God. So God is not at the center, but man or human being is at the center. That is what Renaissance wanted to establish. So the revival of ancient learning is the very important feature that we find in during the Renaissance period. Now, with the revival of classical learning, all the things that changed, the perspective of interpreting knowledge, the perspective of reading a book, everything changed. And what happened? Literary theory and criticism, that received a new emphasis, and there was a marked change in the outlook from theocratic to secular. So what happened? Renaissance actually that Renaissance actually did what? Still, people are joining. Renaissance actually promoted secular views, secular writings, secular literature. So before that, during the Middle Ages, there was no such thing as secular writing. In the classical period, we find that there are instances of secular writing, secular philosophy, secular thought, secular beliefs. So secular means something which is not related to religion or institutionalized religion. But Middle Ages, that promoted something, everything that has close connection to institutionalized religion. And institutionalized religion is a machinery, it's just like a state machinery that oppresses, that controls, that approximates, and that appropriates. Now, we find that the Renaissance actually, it revived that promotion of secular beliefs, secular thoughts, and secular writings. The great works of antiquity they started to translate the works of the classical period, and they started editing large number of books that were brought all over from Europe. So there was a spark of translation. So what are the basic things that we find in literature during the Renaissance? What we find in the literary world during the Renaissance, that they started translating the works from Greek and Roman, from Latin and Greek, and at the same time they started reviving the wisdom that were in vogue during the classical period. So it was believed that and what happened, that Renaissance started in Italy, and then it spread all over into Europe. And after some time, France and England and all the European other countries, they got the very test of Renaissance, that is the revival of writing, that is the reformation of the religious beliefs. Okay, the invention and what and another very important thing that happened during Renaissance is the invention of the printing press. So what happened with the invention of the printing press? They started printing the books. And what was the first book that was printed? That was Bible. So when Bible comes to printing press, what happened? Bible became easily available. Now, when before that, Bible was something which was actually copied. The clerks in the church, clerks means the clergymen, those who were the religious men, they used to copy Bible. So when you are copying one Bible from another Bible, so you won't get a large number of Bible at the same time. So it becomes a very precious thing. So when something is very dear, something is very precious, something is very costly, it is beyond the control, beyond the catch of the common people. So when I don't have the first hand knowledge of touching a book or opening a book or reading a book, what will happen? So I have to go to the church. I need a help. I need the help of a deputy who will interpret the things for me. So I'm going to the church to listen to the gospels of God. So for God, I need a mediator who will interpret the things to me. And when the mediator is interpreting, he or she is interpreting according to his own needs. So when I am interpreting something to you, and when I know that you don't have the power to have that book, to grab that book, to go and buy that book, what will happen? You will, I know very well that you are completely dependent upon me. So when you are dependent upon me, I can interpret the things according to my own need. So when I'm interpreting Bible, I'm adding some extra shots, I'm having add-ons with that Bible, that Jesus has said this and this. The church becomes more important than Jesus himself. The gospels were less important, but the dictums of the church, the directives of the church, the control of the church, that were promoted more than the gospels or than what actually Bible wanted to preach. So this misinterpretation of Bible which were done, this which was done by the church during that period, you will find that when there was the invention of the printing press and Bible was printed into it, it became very easily available. You can go and buy the book because Bible becomes available to the common people. And when I can go and buy a book, I can have a look. When I am reading it, when I am reading the Bible, so I can realize that what I have heard in the church is quite different from what I am reading. Such things are not there in this book, but there I have heard that the clergyman, the priest is telling me that these things are also there in Bible, so you need to follow that. Now, when I can tally the things that I have heard at the church and what I can read in the book, I can tally them. I will be able to understand that certain things were not there in the book, but they were added or they were misinterpreted. So what will happen? I will start questioning the very authority of the church, that no, this is not, these things are not there in the Bible. This is something which you have added, which is not true, which is very much apocryphal. So this is the thing. Now, the printing press was established and books became easily available. Another thing is important, that is the Renaissance period saw the translation of the classical books. Not only they translated Horace's Ars Poetica, but Horace's Ars Poetica was something which was very famous during the Middle Ages also, but they also translated Aristotle's Poetics, which was sent to oblivion. People became oblivious of Aristotle's poetics during the Middle Ages. That was also revived. They revived the reading of Aristotle poetics. Not only that, they also started translating not only Horace's Ars Poetica but also Aristotle's Poetics. Along with Aristotle's Poetics and along with Horace's Ars Poetica, what they also translated was the Bible. So Bible was something which was actually written in Hebrew, then it was translated into Latin. But Hebrew or Latin were not the language of the common people in England or other European countries. So it was something just like our Sanskrit, because Sanskrit is a language, it's a classical language, and the common man, they don't know how to read or write or understand or comprehend Sanskrit. Just the same thing is with Latin, because it was not the language of the common people. And when some people started translating Bible from Latin into English, what happened? The common people also were exposed to Bible. And when the common people were exposed to Bible, they also had that sort of realization that no, these certain things were not there, or these certain things are not there in my religion, neither these things are written in this Bible. So they can understand the reality that it is a church as authority, the institutionalized religion, which actually wants to impose all these extra things on us. It is a sort of oppression that the church does upon us, and they started questioning the thing. And this particular trait you will find in the very basic worldview of Renaissance. That is how human beings became important. So God as a very epitome of institutionalized religion, that became less important, and more important, human beings became more important. So human beings were at the center of the earth, the center of this creation, not God. God not only created human beings, but it was also the human beings who created God. God created us. That was the belief. Now they started believing the fact that we created God. We made someone the God. Okay, so I said that Horace's Ars Poetica was something which was very famous during during the Middle Ages, but the Renaissance not only revived and translated Horace's Ars Poetica, but they also started translating and reading Aristotle's Poetics. Now, the Poetics of Aristotle, uh, that what happened, that became again important during the Renaissance period of late, almost unknown throughout the Middle Ages. But the Renaissance revived the reading and understanding of Aristotle. The first critical edition of the work, that is Aristotle's Poetics, was it was a Latin commentary, and it was published by a person called Robertello. So Robertello was the first person who, in the year 1548, first translated Aristotle's Poetics from Greek to Latin, and the very next year it was translated into Italian. So from Greek, Robertello translated Aristotle's Poetics into Latin 1548, and in 1549, that is the very next year, it was translated into Italian. So now you can see that how the translation of a book actually moves towards the common people. So Greek is something which is a very classical language, exclusively classical language. Latin is a classical language, but more people, they can understand, read and write Latin than Greek. Now it was translated into Latin, and after that it was translated into Italian, which was the language of the common people of Italy. And Aristotle's Poetics became more accessible. Now, after this translation and annotated and critical editions of Aristotle's treatise on the art of poetry, that is, Poetics is actually a treatise on the art of poetry, followed in a quick succession. And Aristotle, so what happened when Aristotle was translated into Italian, after all, finally, Aristotle became a very influential figure, literary figure again. So Aristotle was revived in the during the Renaissance period. So he became the predominant force in Renaissance criticism. Editions and translations of Aristotle, not only Aristotle, but Horace, Plato, and the other Greek masters that became very much in vogue during the Renaissance period. Now, the Renaissance had a great Italian influence. So the chief concern of the age that we see that actually comes from the influence of Italy, the Italian influence, because Renaissance in Europe first started in Italy, and from Italy it actually spread to other countries. So Italy was the pioneer in the field of field means in the field of Renaissance thinking, and the Italian influence remained predominant all through the 16th and early 17th century. So we see that the Italian influence was there all throughout the 16th and 17th century. This is so much the case that some critics, even just like Spingram, goes to the extent of saying that what did Spingram say? I'll quote, says that English theory of poetry during Renaissance is very much the same as Italian poetics, and it cannot be appreciated fully without a knowledge of its Italian counterpart. So Spingram says that the Renaissance that started from Italy and afterwards it was spread all over in Europe. So we find that when England became aware of the Renaissance thoughts and Renaissance belief, but their understanding of Renaissance was highly influenced by the Italian way of thinking, the Italian way of understanding and appreciating and interpreting literature. So the Italian influence was a great influence even upon the English Renaissance. So uh, now we will categorically understand the Renaissance influence in England. So critical writings in Italy and so also in England were mainly of five kinds. So we see that regarding the Renaissance writings, how many we can categorize the Renaissance writings into five categories. So this is the thing. Just you can note that one number one. So there are five types of writings that we find in the English Renaissance and Italian Renaissance as well. Number one, the classical critical texts. Please note it down. The classical critical texts with critical commentaries and annotations. So there were the classical critical texts and the critical commentaries and annotations, and all these things were translated into vernacular languages like Italian first and then English and French and all. So number one were the classical critical texts with annotations and commentaries. Now, as noted above, such texts provided a powerful stimulus to critical writing in all European countries. Now, these classical critical texts were the influence, that were the source which influenced the other European critical thinkers to write books following that. Number one is classical critical texts. Number two, there are the poetic or versified treatises, the poetic or versified treatise on the art of poetry, just like Horace's Ars Poetica, just the same thing that you will find in Renaissance Italy and England as well. So the poetic or versified treatise or discussion, treatise means discussion, analytical discussion on the art of poetry, just like Horace's Ars Poetica. So number one is classical critical texts. Number two, versified or poetic treatise. Number three, scientific and ambitiously professed treatise on the art of poetry. So there are, number one is classical critical text, number two is poetic or versified treatise, number three that is scientific and ambitiously professed treatise on the art of poetry in imitation of Aristotle's Poetics. So Aristotle's Poetics is a very scientific commentary on the very art of poetry, books like this. So this is number three. There are deliberately scientific and ambitiously professed treatises like Aristotle's Poetics. Now we see the most popular and valuable of such treatises we find during the Renaissance, Italy and France are the writings by Italian critic Mintano and the French critic Scaliger. So the Italian critic Mintano or the French critic Scaliger, they wrote books or treatises following Aristotle. Just like Aristotle wrote Poetics, Mintano or Scaliger in Italian and in French wrote similar scientifically and ambitiously professed books on the art of the imitation of poetry. So this is number C or 3. Number 4, there were apologies or defenses, just the thing that we will read in our syllabus. There were apologies or defenses of poetry written in reply to the criticism of the moralists and other enemies of poetry. So there were certain Puritans or moralists who used to defame poetry, saying that it is something very debased. A poetry leads us to nowhere. Poetry has no worth. It is a worthless thing. It is something which only gives pleasure to the children and to the novices. So some critics or the moralists or the Puritans, they used to debase poetry. And the Italian critics, there were some Italian critics who used to write defenses or apology supporting poetry, just like what Sydney has said. So number 4 is defenses or apologies written in support of poetry. So there were certain Puritans or moralists who used to debase poetry, that saying that poetry is something which preaches immorality. Poetry is something which only entertains the novice and the children. It is worthless, and they actually give the instance of Plato. Plato has said that in his Republic, he has said that poets should be banished from the Republic. But interestingly enough, Plato's dialogues are written in poetry. So critics like Sidney, they did what? They wrote certain defenses or apologies supporting poetry and establishing the fact that poetry is something which has worth. Poetry and poets are the poets are the seers, they are the truth seekers, and poetry is worthy, and our poetry is visionary. Poetry can see something beyond the reality, and poetry is not responsible for preaching immorality. But Sidney has said in his apology that it is the
Sir,
misuse
will
and
you please
abuse of
repeat number
poetry
three?
is responsible for for this morality, or this spread of immorality. And the abuse of poetry is something which should be addressed, which should be corrected or rectified. So this is D on number 4. So we have classical critical writings, number 1. Number 2, poetical or versified treatise. Number 3, scientific and ambitiously professed works on the imagination and theory of poetry. Number 4, the apologies or defenses of poetry. And number 5, the preface. The number 5 is the preface or special treatise. It is this preface writings, the very beginning part of a treatise, the preface of a treatise, directed against classical objections to some particular romantic form or some literary text in a vernacular. So there were certain classical objections to the imagination that poetry takes resort to. So the classicists, the classical writers and thinkers believe that romantics, this is very much romantic, and it is worthless at the same time to give too much indulgence on imagination. So this is not the thing. These prefaces to certain treaties, they supported the imagination that was there, and they wanted to establish the fact that imagination is something which is the heart, which is the very nucleus of poetry. Out without imagination, nothing will be created, nothing will be worthy in poetry or any work of art. So these are the five categories of writings that we find in classical in Renaissance England or Italy, that these five types of writings were the product of Renaissance or the revival of learning. Now, uh, I would like to give some examples of the fifth category. The best of such defenses that we find in the preface to certain treatises are Sir John Harrington's preface to the translation of Aristo. Sir John Harrington's preface to the translation of Aristo, and George Chapman's preface to the translation of Iliad. So these two are the examples of category 5, that is preface to certain treatises directed against classical objections to some particular romantic traits in poetry. So just sum up the Renaissance critical uh, ways of thinking, what actually the critical trends that we find during Renaissance. That is, the Renaissance critics were interested in literary genres, number one. The Renaissance critics were interested in literary genres, number one. Number two, decorum and rules. Decorum and rules. Number three, the classic versus English meters. So these things that we find in Renaissance criticism, number one is literary genre, number two, decorum and rules, number three, the classic versus English meters, number four, justification of imaginative literature, justification of imaginative literature in the face of attacks from purists and moralists. That last point is very important, that the Renaissance critics were interested in establishing or justifying the imaginative literature which were objectionable, which the classical critics censured or criticized in their writings. So the Renaissance critic wanted to establish the supremacy of imaginative literature in the face of attacks from purists and moralists. So I will end this class today here. The next class we will show the evolution of Renaissance criticism. What are the phases that we find in the very journey of Renaissance criticism? Okay, and then we will move on to the text of Sidney's Apology for Poetry. Till then, thank you, and if you have any problem,